So it should come as no surprise that I've come here to tell a spy story today. But this one is a little different, and it's not just because I'm getting it in a brewery, though I've never done that before. That is unique. But let me explain. My previous books were cloak and drama stories set against the background of 2 world wars, suspenseful stories, dramatic, but histories really. And when I started to write In the Enemy's House, it was a Cold War story, a unique angle that I was telling. It was filled with suspense and drama, but again, it was a history, a story about the past. But as I sat writing and researching this book, I have a hilltop in Connecticut that almost looks like the countryside around here, and I write isolated from the world. Headlines kept on intruding. I turn on the news, I pick up the New York Times, and I was drawn into a spy story that was happening today, just as the way all of you were too. We are all living through a Cold War spy drama now, it seems. And then Vanity Fair asked me to start writing about Russia's playing fast and loose in the last election. So now I was juggling these 2 stories, one in the past, one in the present, and I began to realize that my story from the Cold War resonated across the decades and informed what I was writing now, that these 2 stories were really part of the same story I was telling. And then there was something else energizing me, goading me on as I continued writing. It was a memory I had of 30 years ago when I was a young cub reporter at the New York Times, and I was invited to the tennis matches at Forest Hills. And my host said he'd pick me up in front of my apartment house in Manhattan, and I'm waiting out there on the street, and I see this long, gargantuan limousine coming up, a really fatuous car, and I assume my host is sitting in the back like a mogul, but as the car approaches, I realize that he's driving this long limousine. And there is Donald Trump at the wheel of the car, coming to pick me up to take me to the tennis matches. But I get ahead of myself. I will circle back to that story, and I will explain, it's the punchline, if you will, of the tale I want to tell. So let me begin with how I began my adventure for writing In the Enemy's House. It began when I received an unmarked envelope in the mail, which I quickly deduced was from the CIA. How did I come to this conclusion? Well, a couple of weeks earlier, I had been up at Langley talking to one of the agency's historians, trying to get research for my last book, The Last Good Night. And while our conversation was winding down, I said, well, you know, if there are any stories come your way you think would be interesting to tell, I'm always interested. And, you know, reporters are a pushy bunch. We don't let any opportunity pass us by. And he looked at me sort of inscrutably and said nothing. The conversation continued a bit. But then 10 days later, this envelope comes in the mail. I open it up, and it's a photocopy of a short speech from the Symposium on Cryptological History. And I think, well, that's a really fun crowd. I'm not going to get through this, but I started reading it, and I was hooked. It was a short story about a sort of rebellious FBI agent who teams up with a sort of nerdy, detached, head-in-the-clouds codebreaker. Bob Lamphere is the FBI agent. Meredith Gardner is the genius codebreaker. And together, they go on a hunt to find the spies who've stolen our atomic secrets. And I finished this brief speech, and I thought, well, this is a story I want to tell, but can I actually get the goods? My stories, my books are true stories, and yet they're also dramatic, and I hope suspenseful. And to do that, I have to get into the minds of my characters. I have to know what they said and what they thought. And in a nonfiction book, that's always a challenge, and it's a particular challenge when they're deceased. So I went on a trail to see if I could hunt them down, and hunt down their relatives, their surviving relatives. And I wound up in Roanoke, Virginia with Bob Lamphere as the FBI man's widow, speaking with her at length. she directed me to other relatives who were in Seattle, who had written a private history of the family, the Lamphere Anthology. I met with Meredith Gardner's son and his daughter-in-law in Wisconsin. They provided me with letters, memories, stories, and also 6 notebooks that Meredith Gardner had written over the course of his life. His musings on genealogy, his favorite sherry, and also the Rosenburg case. And at the same time, I started poking around official Washington. I went to the NSA, the FBI, and fortunately, a great many documents have been recently declassified, and I was given access to that. But to make this story work, I had to tell the other side of the story, the Soviet side. And again, in 1991, after the fall of the collapse of the Soviet Union, a great many documents were smuggled out of Moscow Center, as the KGB headquarters is known. And also many of these old spies, proud of what they accomplished for Mother Russia, had written their memoirs. It also was a way to pad their retirement accounts. And these were chatty, very informative documents. I entered a world of tradecraft, of dead drops, rendezvous, code words, and it was as if an episode of The Americans had come to life on the page. And I thought this was pretty cool. I could now write a spy versus spy story. I had the facts, and I began to write. And so the story I tell really begins on November 5th in Moscow Center in 1940, when the head of the Foreign Intelligence Service of the KGB, Pavlo Fitkin, gets a copy of the New York Times is brought to him. And he's pointed to a story that talks about atomic research that's being done in America, that the atom is going to be a source of tremendous power. And the man who brings this to him is the head of the KGB's Director of Science and Technology, in effect, Leonid Kazanov. And he's telling him, while the Times doesn't mention this, the Americans and the West are going to use this source of atomic energy to create a super weapon, the most powerful weapon the world has ever seen, a weapon with enormous power. And a few days later, Fitkin gathers up all his associates, heads of the directorate, and he tells Kasnikov he's setting a new mission for him. It's going to be called Operation Enormous. He wants to get America's atomic secret. And by get, he means steal. So he sends Kasnikov to the United States. He's cover of Trade Council, and he's given the mission to set up networks. But Kasnikov doesn't speak English very well, so he's given a legman, someone to actually meet with the American spies to handle these operations. And he's given a man who's a recent graduate of the Soviet School of Special Assignments, their KGB school. He's a practitioner in coding, handling agents, and silent killing. His name is Alexander Felsikov. He's known to his friends as Sasha, and he comes to New York to work in the embassy in New York, which was then on 61st Street, and to run the networks. At the same time, in Washington, D.C., Bob Lamphere is a young, rebellious FBI agent, and he's just been assigned to the SE, that's the Soviet espionage desk. And he hates it. He thinks this is Siberia. It's just watcher's work, surveillance duty, and he wants to be in the thick of things. He thinks it's a particularly ludicrous assignment because, as he complains, it doesn't take long for the Soviet diplomats he's trailing to realize the guy in the fedora and the suit and tie is an FBI agent. And also, and this is a view held by many in the intelligence community back then, the Soviets are our allies in World War II. They're our friends. 27 million Russians are dying to fight the Nazis. We're giving them, a fortune in Lend-Lease equipment. We're all on the same side. And in this sort of mood of disgust, what he's doing, being the SE desk, he meets with his boss, a man by the name of Pat Coyne, and he tells him he's fed up, he's disgusted with this assignment. So Coyne wants to keep this young FBI man in the bureau. He doesn't want him to quit, so he lets him in on a secret. And he opens up an old Mosler safe that he has in his office, and he takes out a top secret file, and he says, the United States government has been trying to read the Soviet cable. Not with too much success, but we figure there are going to be peace talks coming in the war, and the general in charge of this operation is a poker player, and he said the best way to win at poker is to know what cards the other man has. And so we're trying to break their codes to read, in effect, their cards. And he asked Bob if he'd be interested in this. And Lanphier figures anything is better than, following Russians around Washington, D.C., or standing out in the rain while they're eating their dinners. So he said, yeah, I'll do it, even though he knows he's not even interested in crossword puzzles. Maybe he can help. So they hand him the folder, and he looks at it, and he can't make head or tails of it. It's really just not words even, just a couple of letters, maybe a phrase. It makes no sense at all. And Bob is thinking, what have I done? At the same time, his superior tells him about the man he's going to be working with, the man who's running the operation to break the Russian codes is a guy by the name of Meredith Gardner. And he's a genius. He knows 6 or 7 languages, including Sanskrit. He'd come to the United States code-breaking facility called Arlington Hall to work on the German codes. But when they had success with that, he was moved over to work on the Japanese codes, and he taught himself really, while working the day in 3 months Japanese fluently, he was able to speak it. He was a genius, but he's head in the clouds, very detached, very hard to get along with. So with that warning ringing in Bob's ears, he goes the next day to Arlington Hall. Arlington Hall was before the war a girls' finishing school, a pampered place for pampered young women. It had swimming pools and stables, acres of lawn, gardens. And when Bob walks through the checkpoint past the barbed wire fences, he notices something that surprises him. As he says, there's an army of young women in the Virginia countryside. The women had joined up during the war because the men were all fighting to work as code breakers, and many of them had stayed after the war. And Bob, who in many ways was a personification for the Me Too movement being way overdue, was tantalized by this opportunity to work surrounded by all these women. He was a real womanizer. And he's going around saying hello, and he makes his way finally to Meredith Gardner's office. And Gardner should be expecting him, and he sees this sort of tall string bean of a man hunched over his desk, not looking up. Bob, very jovially, he's a hell fellow sort, introduces himself. Gardner still doesn't look up to him. And Bob says, I'm here to help. What can I do? And Bob feels as if an eternity passes. And finally, Gardner looks up and says, I don't know. And the conversation went downhill from there. But in the weeks that follow, Bob keeps on coming back to Arlington Hall to see Meredith. It's one of the secrets or mysteries of this operation. If there hadn't been so many young women at Arlington Hall, Bob still have kept coming. But he kept on coming there, and each time he would go see Meredith, and Meredith said he really didn't know what he could do to help. What Meredith wasn't telling him is that he had some success in trying to crack the Russian code. The Russian code was much more complicated than the German and Japanese code because the Soviet cipher specialists had, in effect, they would take their message, then they would lock it in a code, put it into code, which was locking the door once, then they'd lock the door again for a second time by putting it into a cipher, and then they'd burn their cipher pad, a one-time pad, So in effect, throwing the key away. So when they did these 3 steps, it was foolproof, unless the Soviets did something foolish, and they had. In November 1941, when the German army was outside Moscow, the KGB cipher specialists thought that there were more pressing problems for Mother Russia than using the pieces of carbon paper only once. Their one-time pads became 3-time pads. And the genius codebreakers at Arlington Hall saw this repetition, and they saw that this impenetrable wall had now a flaw, and they began to take this impenetrable wall apart brick by brick by brick, and they were able to strip these messages of their encipherment. But they were still encoded. And this is what Meredith Gardner was trying to do. He was trying to take apart the code. It was sort of like a game of Wheel of Fortune. You get a vowel and you try to build to a word and then a phrase. But of course, it all wasn't Cyrillic. And he had done this. He was making some progress, but he was pretty much stumped. And so, in this sort of despairing, dispiriting mood, Bob Lamphere comes to him in 1948 on one afternoon and says, "Well, Meredith, is there anything I can do to help?" And for once, Meredith said, "Yes, there is." And he said, "Can you get me the plain text of a Soviet message?" That's a message before the Soviets are sending it, before it's been encrypted or encoded. And Bob says, "I'll try." But meanwhile, he's thinking, why doesn't he ask me for the key to Fort Knox? But Bob goes back to the FBI headquarters and puts in a request for plain text messages, not thinking anything will happen. And several days later, a folder is placed on his desk, and it's full of plain text messages. And he goes to his boss and said, "Where'd you get these? Where'd you get these Russian plain text messages?" And his boss says, "What messages? There's nothing here. Those don't exist. We wouldn't have them." And that's when Bob knew these were the results of a black bag job, an illegal act of breaking into a Soviet trade mission in New York, photographing these documents without a warrant. It would never hold up in a court of law, but the only judge Bob had to go before was Meredith Gardner in Arlington Hall. So he takes these messages to Meredith, leaves them on Meredith's desk, and he comes back about 2 weeks later. And when he returns, there's a new Meredith. Meredith is elated. He's saying, we did it, we're actually making progress. And Bob is also elated because he's using the pronoun we. They are now a team and they can move forward. At the same time as they're beginning to make inroads into the Soviet code, Sasha is going around running these networks of agents, and they're having meets, and their tradecraft is sometimes ludicrous even. The orders coming from Moscow Center. He's told to meet one agent on a street corner in the Lower East Side of New York in the middle of winter at night, holding one tennis ball in his hand. Another time he has to meet an agent in Central Park with his shoelaces undone. That's the recognition signal. Or they meet on a bridge in New Mexico, not far from Los Alamos, which is well trafficked, and they're standing out in public. But it all works, and he's compiled thousands of pages, which really are a primer for given to the Soviets, how to build an atom bomb. But now Meredith and Bob are also making progress, and they've discovered the existence of Operation Romance. They're discovering the existence of Soviet networks of spies around the country. But Russians have put in another hurdle for them to deal with. Even though they can read the cables now, the agents are identified by code names, such as REST or Goose or Antenna. There's one agent that they're particularly interested in called Liberal, and he's running a group of at least a dozen agents that are tied into military facilities and Defense Department industries. And they can't get any clue really on him, except Meredith is able to translate a cable that talks about his wife. Her name is Ethel, and it says very clearly, she does not work. That means she's not an active agent. She doesn't have a code name. She is probably complicitous. She knows what her husband is doing, but she's really not a Soviet spy. But Bob is trying to figure out who this liberal with the wife named Ethel can be, and he can't get anywhere. At the same time, Meredith translates another cable, that there's an agent by the name of Rest who passes on a top secret classified report on the diffusion process, which is a key process in making an atom and a hydrogen bomb to the Soviets. And Bob tracks down this report. There were only 12 scientists who had access to it. He goes through the list, lots of dead ends and lots of mistakes, as I recount on page after page. And he finally identifies the man who passed this on. It's a man by the name of Klaus Fuchs, a British scientist who was working at Los Alamos. He's now at Harwell, the British atomic research facility. Fuchs is arrested. Hoover sends Bob off to interrogate him, and they find out about a courier who is working with Fuchs, who's working for the Soviets, an American. And Meredith then takes apart another telegram. He unbuttons it, as they say in the trade, and he realizes that this courier went to meet with Fuchs' sister, who is living now in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and at Harvard. They tell him some information that allow them to identify this courier, which is known as Raymond. Once they get him to talk, as Sasha says, and he's now at Moscow Center, he's fled, all the dominoes begin to fall, and Bob and Meredith begin picking up Soviet spies one by one. They track down Liberal, who turns out to be Julius Rosenburg. They begin to close in on his ring. And as they make these arrests, as the indictments occur, it's a time of great triumph for Bob and Meredith. They've done something that seemed previously impossible. They've broken an unbreakable code. They've been patriots. They've helped America. And for Meredith, who's lived in the world of the mind for so many years, he's now brought into the real world. And they're feeling very glad about what they've done. And then something quite unexpected happens. Both Ethel and Julius Rosenberg are indicted and put on trial by the government. And Bob knows and Meredith knows that while Julius is no doubt guilty, Ethel really was just a hanger-on. She might have known about the recruitment of her brother. She knew what her husband was doing, but she certainly didn't steal any atomic secrets, and she's facing the death penalty. But they figure that the government's just doing this, trying to put pressure on the Rosenbergs to talk. Then the trial comes, and they're convicted, and now they're awaiting sentence. And the sentence could be death in the electric chair. And now Bob and Meredith are wondering what they can do. They are sworn to secrecy. These cables that they've deciphered, the program at Arlington Hall, it's top secret. Not even the president knows that they're reading Soviet cables. The prosecutors don't, the judges don't. What can they do? The most Bob can do is he goes to J. Edgar Hoover, who knows about the program, and he asks him to write a letter to the judge, which Bob drafts. And Hoover, to his credit, writes this letter asking for clemency for Ethel. He gives it to the judge and has no effect. Both Ethel and Julius Rosenberg are executed. And after their execution, Bob and Meredith feel that in a way they have done something to be ashamed of. Their actions have offended their own sense of honor. In a way, they begin to die a death too, and their whole careers take a different turn. And that largely is the story I tell in The Enemy's House. But as I said at the beginning, at the same time, I and all of us here were living through our own spy story. And as I wrote through Vanity Fair articles about Russia's intervention in the last election, I realized that what was happening today was simply a continuation about what had started 70 years ago. The past was not past. But the lessons were not just really this discovery, this awareness of the long length and time of Russia's covert war against America, but there are other lessons too. Take, for example, the promiscuous and divisive use of the word witch hunt. Now, the thing about witch hunts is there are no witches. It's the pursuit of something that doesn't exist, and the word then has become a sort of political metaphor. It's a way of turning the rhetorical tables so that it's the accuser, not those who are accused, who are the villains. And it's a shorthand that was used very effectively in the Cold War era by the left when they were protesting the pernicious belligerence of McCarthy and also arguing that the Rosenbergs weren't guilty. And it's a phrase that's also used today by the right, led by a vociferous and indignantly tweeting president, that another witch hunt is taking place. So it's a phrase full of scorn, redolent with history, and one that's been used by both sides in the political debates. But while witches don't exist, facts do. There are certain hard facts that affect world historical events. Take the story I tell in the Enemy's House. Well, the nation was divided for years, and to some people, even to this day, about whether or not the Rosenbergs were guilty. Our spy masters knew the truth. Meredith Gardner and Bob Lanphier had uncovered an arsenal of smoking guns. Yet they kept this evidence secret from the president, from Congress, from the prosecutors. If they had come forward with this evidence, it would have perhaps put an end to the McCarthy era, and it would have probably saved Ethel Rosenberg's life. But why didn't they do it? Well, the ostensible reason that it wasn't in the national interest to let the Soviets know that we were reading their mail. But this was a remarkably disingenuous argument, because our spy masters knew that the Russians had two moles at Arlington Hall, moles that had informed them that they were reading our cables. So really, why did they keep this secret? I would suggest that it wasn't for any strategic reason, but it's more part of the DNA, the mindset of intelligence agencies. Secrets are their capital, their currency, and capital is something that one never touches. So today, too, we're stuck at another moment in history when the nation is being divided, when there seems to be partisan divides fractionalizing this country. And once again, I believe our spy masters are standing complacently on the sidelines. Take, for example, the case of Carter Page, a former foreign policy advisor to the Trump campaign. On 4 occasions, the FISA court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Agency, decided that they had enough information, enough evidence to wiretap Carter Page. 4 judges approved this, 3 Republicans. What is this evidence? Can sources and methods be protected and share this with the American people? The New York Times has filed a Freedom of Information suit to get this information, and I think it's an important suit, and I hope it's successful, because I think our spy masters have to realize that witch hunts are also not in the national interest, and the only way to end a witch hunt is to drive a stake of truth into the heart of the matter. Which brings me back to that image I spoke about earlier of that memorable day when I went off with Donald Trump driving me to the tennis matches. Well, it's now 30 years later, and now President Trump is still at the wheel, yelling fake news, and taking all of us for a ride. But the only way to put an end to fake news is to get the facts, to get to drive it, again, a stake of truth into the heart of the matter. And I hope there will be, in this generation, another Bob Lamphere and another Meredith Gardner who can get to the bottom of things. Thank you.
Howard is happy to take some questions here. If we could use the microphones, appreciate it, because we are recording this. So let us give you the mic if you have a question.
Okay, the Rosenbergs had two sons who were adopted by the same couple, and they changed their names. Well, they were trying, at one time, these sons were trying to prove that their mother was innocent. But they knew one of them, anyway, had gone with the father on taking public transportation to meet people and so forth. So they knew the father was guilty, but they were trying to prove the mother's innocence. were they ever able to do that?
The Merkels, that's their name now, the Rosenberg sons, have petitioned President Obama to try to get their mother's verdict changed, but he refused to go along with it. So far, they have not been successful. The question is, she's not innocent. She may not be guilty of a crime that deserved execution, but she did help recruit her brother, David Greenglass, to work at Los Alamos and smuggle secrets out. And she did know about her husband's ring. So she was complicit in all this. But again, Klaus Fuchs, who really gave the Russians a primer on how to build the bomb, was given a 14-year jail sentence. That's all he got. Another person, Ted Hall, who was a 19-year-old Harvard student who went to work at Los Alamos, he gave the Russians a great deal of information that was very valuable. Nothing ever happened to him because all the government had on him was these cables, the Venona cables as they were known, that Meredith decoded, and they couldn't introduce them into court. He was able to live out his life, went to Cambridge, England, and became a biologist there. So it's this severity of the crime, I think, that Ethel Rosenberg faced as the issue, not whether or not she was guilty or innocent.
Other questions?
Sir?
Could you elaborate?
Sir?
Sorry. Well, I figure I'll speak up if that's all right. Open tape.
Could you elaborate on your impression of, quote, the deep state as it exists now?
The phrase deep state, I hate that phrase. I mean, the United States has intelligent facilities, intelligence organizations, thank God. They make mistakes. I make mistakes, but I think a deep state is putting a pernicious spin on our intelligence activities. I would like to see, we all would like to see what's going to happen with the Mueller investigation. How much further are we going to get? Do they really, to me, everything is going to turn, and I could be wrong, on the Cohen investigation. Was Cohen really in Prague? I had done a piece for Vanity Fair on the Christopher Steele dossier, and I had spoken to Cohen, and he swore up and down he had never been to Prague. And Vanity Fair, Condé Nast lawyers maybe take out any reference to that in the piece. Now it seems that he might have been. On Meet the Press today, before I came, I was watching, they were taking it quite seriously. So I think it's not so much the deep state, but it's intelligence agencies. We need them to help get to the bottom of things, and I hope they're going to be working hand in hand with Mueller to get the answers.
Hang on a second.
Thanks for your talk. You mentioned all these clandestine drops or meetings and the tennis ball and the shoelaces and whatnot. I take it these are part of Julius Rosenberg's ring. Who were these Americans and what were they motivated by?
Well, Rosenberg's ring were largely a group of city college students, and they wanted to help Russia. Many of these people felt that if the U.S. alone had the atom bomb, we would use it against Russia in the early 1950s, we would bomb Russia. And that would lead to more deaths and more wars. They took it upon themselves to create what they felt was a balance of power. In a way, though, it led to the Korean War. It gave the Russians encouragement the North could invade the South in Korea. And, tens of thousands of Americans died and wounded.
Other questions?
You're talking about Fuchs. Okay, I forget where he was originally from. I think it was Germany, wasn't it?
Yes.
Okay, he got citizenship in England, and the reason that he gave for turning over the atomic secrets, because he thought that more countries should know it instead of just one country having it. But he was most hurt by it because England took away his citizenship. He was most hurt by that when that happened.
Another interesting thing about England and Fuchs, he could not face the death penalty because Russia was an ally of England during the war, and so he was giving information to an ally. So that's why his sentence was 14 years.
You suggest giving out trade crafts and secrets of our intelligence community. Do you think that'll put us at a disadvantage to the other countries around the world, such as Russia right now?
It's not as blanket as trade crafts. I think, take a case of the Carter Page indictment, or the decision to wiretap him. You can explain what sort of evidence we had without revealing the sources and the methods to get that. I mean, the country is so divided now. You can explain the case we had on the Rosenbergs, as we had to wait till 1995 till these cables were released to the public, while the nation was divided for years. Alger Hiss case, all these names from the 50s. I grew up, went to school with Alger Hiss's son, and always thought this guy was victimized, a poor son, and it wasn't a good life for Tony Hiss, but his father was guilty, and we had the evidence. And I believe there should be a little more light shed on that, but I don't want to reveal methods.
Other questions? Anybody? Well, let's give Howard a round of applause.